Stroke counts are very easy to get started with. All swimmers have to do is count. All you have to do is count. Stroke rates are a little bit trickier. It's a little less obvious where to start and what to do. Let's fix that. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. I was recently asked how to calculate stroke rates, so I'm going to go over some pretty simple concepts, and these concepts should hopefully provide clarity about how to get started with stroke rates. We'll cover how to measure them, how to help swimmers stay accountable to them, what's a good stroke rate, and how to assign stroke rates. If you're finding stroke rates to be a little bit intimidating, hopefully this will help. So there are two ways to measure stroke rates. The first is you can measure how many cycles there are per minute, which is typically a non-American way to do it. So everyone else tends to use this measure. Americans do something a little bit differently. So for example, if a swimmer was to perform 60 stroke cycles in a minute, their stroke rate would be 60. So what you do is you take your stopwatch, you click it on the mode, and then you go to the one that's like that. It just has a bunch of zeros. And so what that will do is when the swimmer hits their hand on the water to start a stroke cycle, you start it, and then you wait. And at the end of the third stroke cycle, you'll stop your watch, and then you'll look at it, and it'll give you a stroke rate in cycles per minute. It's pretty difficult to calculate it otherwise. That's a really simple way to do it. And so if you want to use cycles per minute, using your stopwatch is a great way to do that. Alternatively, you can measure a stroke rate by how long it takes to complete a stroke cycle. Using our previous example, if a swimmer takes 60 strokes per minute, that means they're taking one stroke every second. So their stroke rate is also one cycle per second. This is typically how stroke rates are used in America. It's not better or worse, it's just different, and you can use whatever style that you want. Using cycles per second is very simple, it's easy to calculate, and it's also very easy to see how the stroke rate changes from cycle to cycle. Obviously, I like simple, and so this is the strategy that I tend to use. All you do to use cycles per second, you start your stopwatch, it's running, and then when your swimmer's swimming, when their hand hits to start a stroke cycle, you hit the lap function. When it hits again, you hit the lap function, and then you can just do that. And the callback, the recall on your watch will be in seconds. And for this instance, it's 1.75 seconds per cycle. And then the next one, and then the one before that was 1.35 seconds per cycle. So it's very easy to see how things change from cycle to cycle. And it's also really easy to do on a watch. You can even use a cell phone, any type of device that has a running clock that you can take lap measurements. It's perfect for that. Another reason I like to use cycles per second is because that's how it's typically programmed on a tempo trainer. The tempo trainer will beat after a certain period of time, and it's very easy to adjust. And a lot of times, seconds per cycle is very easy to understand for swimmers, particularly when they're using the tempo trainer, because they make that adjustment. They see 1.2 seconds per cycle. They know what that sounds like. They know what that feels like, and they can relate to it. Now, in terms of accountability, if I'm using stroke rates in training, I'm almost always using a tempo trainer. It's very, very difficult for swimmers to tell if their stroke rate has changed. And if we want them at a certain stroke rate, it's very helpful to have that external reminder of what to do and what rate to use. They need the accountability, they need the feedback, and it's pretty much impossible for you as a coach to manage that and to be getting stroke rates for all your swimmers at the same time constantly. It just doesn't work, and the tempo trainer can let them know if they're on track or if they've fallen off. So instead, let the tempo trainer do the work, especially when they're using very high stroke rates or very low stroke rates, or they're getting tired. It becomes more and more difficult for them to accurately hit the stroke rate without that external feedback. And especially when you're challenging them, you're doing something that they're not used to, it's going to be even more difficult. So make your life easier, use the tempo trainer. Now, if you don't have tempo trainers, then you're probably better off just using stroke counts because it's going to be much easier to manage the whole training process. You're going to be able to accomplish very similar goals with a lot less hassle. Now, what's a good stroke rate? When it comes to racing, there are ranges that swimmers tend to fall into for certain events. If you type something along the lines of swimming racing stroke rate chart into Google or whatever search engine you prefer, you're going to find some answers in terms of what are commonly recommended or commonly found stroke rates for swimmers in competition across all the events. These are great starting points for what's going to be appropriate for a given race for your typical swimmer. Now, of course, different strokes are going to see different stroke rates because the skill is different, and different race distances are going to see different stroke rates as well. Shorter distances, you're going to see higher stroke rates. Longer distances, you're going to see slower stroke rates. And by looking at the charts and getting a sense of what's normal, you can start to get a sense of what type of stroke rate swimmers should be using during certain types of races and during certain types of sets that are supposed to be targeted towards those races. This is useful knowledge when trying to figure out if a given swimmer is using a faster stroke rate, a slower stroke rate, and whether there may be an opportunity to improve there. Now, when it comes to assigning stroke rates in training, racing stroke rates can be a good start. This is especially true when performing race pace work. And what I would suggest is rather than using those charts for individuals, find out what those individuals are doing in their actual races, and you can use those stroke rates as a starting point. So all you need is just video of their race. You just take the stroke rates when you're watching it. You can write it down. Now you know what stroke rate they tend to use in races, and you can use that as a starting point for training. So if you're expecting them to swim around 200 pace, a 200 stroke rate is probably going to be appropriate. And again, in particular, know their 200 stroke rate. While there are certainly trends, there are ranges within races, and some swimmers can be at the bottom, some swimmers can be at the top, and if you try to force them to do the other, they can sometimes struggle. And of course, you can play with using rates that are faster or slower than that racing rate. Using slower rates is going to force swimmers to be more efficient with their skills. They're going to have to create more length with their stroke, and faster rates are going to challenge swimmers to create more speed and execute their skills in less time, which is going to be more difficult. When assigning rates, the biggest thing to look for is what's happening. Are they able to achieve the speeds you want and expect? If you're asking them to go really, really fast and you're asking them to swim at a rate that's probably appropriate for a 1,500 meter race, that's probably going to create a problem. So make sure that the rates allow them to create the speed that you're looking for. Likewise, are they able to be consistent? If you're asking swimmers to perform a 3,000 meter aerobic set and you're having them use stroke rates that would be appropriate for 100 freestyle, they're probably not going to be able to hold that together. They're probably not going to be able to be consistent with that. Finally, are they able to execute good skills with that stroke rate? If it's too slow, they may struggle to hold their skills together. If it's too fast, the same thing can happen. Beyond racing sets, you can also use stroke rates to develop skills and challenge drills. If you want them to perform the drill faster and they're struggling to do that, give them a tempo trainer, jack up the stroke rate, and it will force them to perform that drill faster. Likewise, if you want them to perform that drill slower, give them a tempo trainer, use a stroke rate, but slow that stroke rate down. Here especially, there aren't going to be clear rules in terms of what's an appropriate stroke rate for a given drill, for a given purpose. You're using the rate to get them to change what they're doing. If it looks the way you want it to and they're being challenged appropriately, you're good to go. If not, you're going to have to adjust, either lowering or raising the stroke rate. In almost all cases, the best way to find if the stroke rate is right is to try it, see what happens, and then make adjustments. If you want to learn more about how to use stroke rates to strategically build skills, check out the video here, 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 and here.